Здравствуйте, and welcome to episode 21 of my Soviet Union blog. And in this episode, we're going to be thinking about the status of women and the family and responses to that, policies about that under Khrushchev and Brezhnev, and reflect a little bit on the whole story of women and the family across the Soviet era. So, straight after the war, Second World War, this is the Great Patriotic War, as the Soviets called it. Women, as you might expect, lost the jobs that they'd picked up in the war, or reverted back to unskilled labour, um, as as after the Civil War, and as after wars in Britain too. But there was still an impact that the line between what was male work and what was female work was now much more blurred. And the attitude was that women could work and that they were expected to work in a range of professions. That said, though, part of the story here is that women are still also expected to play a key role in looking after the home and in looking after their husbands and children. And this double pressure put much more work the way of women and made career progression very difficult for them, as probably has been the true in other countries as well. The sort of overview, big picture of this period is that rural areas, the status of women improved slowly under Khrushchev and Brezhnev as the social provision that they emphasised spread into the countryside. Healthcare and maternity benefits improved, and the introduction of an internal passport system in 1974 allowed women that had been stuck in those agricultural jobs to move to towns in search of employment and giving them command perhaps of greater status and pay, although in reality, younger men were often the ones to take advantage of those opportunities. So think about what happened under Khrushchev. The social stability, not the political or economic stability, but the social stability of the Khrushchev era was underpinned by the government's promotion of the family as a social unit, a continuance of the policies under Stalin. In 1960, women made up about 40% of the workforce. And if the wives in a family, if the mother, wife in a family, it was in full-time employment. And the domestic duties were sometimes taken on by older family members. Babushka or grandmothers looked after children. They did homework. They might have done homework. They did housework for sure. And they queued for food. Because in Soviet society, there was great respect for older generation. There were lots of these sort of multi-generational family units, which also has the impact of helping reduce the cost of supporting the sick and the old, and shows how the family unit was now kind of a revered and central part of Soviet society. Khrushchev also does provide help for the family unit by increasing the provision of social benefits. Housing improves, of course, maternity arrangements, healthcare, childcare, all those sort of things are improved in the Khrushchev era. And the family is generally better supported than in the Stalin years. So similar sort of attitude, but better outcomes for the family. And those outcomes are spread to rural areas, not just urban ones. So slow improvement, but improvement. On the other hand, as we know, that women were expected to provide care themselves or work to provide additional family income. The government was aware of that problem and encouraged women to take up those roles in those paid roles. In 1955, abortion was legalised again, partly to allow women to go into work. And abortion continues to be used as a form of contraception. So we're not saying abortion itself is necessarily a negative development, but the way in which it was being used and the motivation for it being reintroduced were both kind of negative things. Under Brezhnev, the threats to the stability of the family were seen to be growing and were taken seriously by the government. Similar, again, attitude towards the family as an important part of Soviet society and concerns about how to protect and help it. And the birth rate was one big concern. And in Russia, and the Western republics of the Soviet Union, actually the birth rate was negative. There wasn't enough people being born to replace the existing population. The average family size in the Soviet Union fell to 1.9 children, below two. Although in the Central Asian republics, where the Islamic republics, actually the birth rate was much higher. By the early 80s, there were calls to use differentiated family allowances to encourage bigger families. although they haven't been put in. And they actually discussed birth incentives in the 1981 Party programme, and the idea of giving women several years off after having children. But none of these things quite come to fruition, but they're acknowledging them, and in their gerontocratic kind of way, hadn't quite got around to resolving them by 1985. Housing was another problem affecting the family unit, and the shortage of adequate housing continued to put strain on families. There were positive developments in the 1970s, but overcrowding was still an issue, and again, not really resolved. Alcoholism is another factor you might want to pick up here as a problem affecting the family. It leads to domestic violence and divorce. By 1982, as you might have heard already, the average Soviet adult was consuming 18 litres of spirits in a year, nearly double the figure that it had been in 1970, just 12 years earlier. And it caused a range of deaths as well. Cirrhosis of the liver, pancreatitis is a major contributor to heart disease, road deaths, suicide. The historian Nemtsov, Nemtsov, reckoned that the effects of alcohol were responsible for over a quarter of all deaths in the Soviet Union in the early 1980s. The government is seemingly unwilling or unable to grapple with this problem, although Andropov tries and Gorbachev tries again in the mid-80s. And there were health campaigns, but it's worth saying that the shops were never short of vodka. The divorce rate was another problem that affected the family, and that divorce rates remained high in the Soviet Union. Over a third of marriages ended in divorce, often linked to alcoholism, and a lot of strain on families because of the lack of a father figure in the household. Some people think that that's an impact from the Second World War, and that also then perhaps impacted upon the alcoholism as well, but that's a bit more speculative. And the 1968 Family Code required couples to give a 1 month notice before a wedding could take place in an effort to make people think more carefully before getting married. And they could actually extend that figure, that time frame, if the registrar suspected that it wasn't a great idea, I guess. And also restrictions were placed on divorce. It was illegal to divorce a pregnant woman or within a year of a child's birth. So attempts were made by the Soviet government to replace the traditional family unit with a collective approach back at the start of the Soviet era, from 1917 through to kind of the mid-20s under Lenin, not always with Lenin's full enthusiasm or endorsement, but that attempt was made. That attempt failed. And from the 1930s all the way through to the 1980s, the family unit is seen as being an integral part of Soviet society. It's supported in various different ways through legal action under Stalin to enforce marriage, divorce, and abortion. But then increasingly after the Second World War, there's social aspects of support under Khrushchev and Brezhnev, or at least grappled with and thought about. And that would kind of be the change element of it. The continuity from Stalin onwards is in the attitude towards the family. If you think about the status of women, again, I would say the status of women flows through at a kind of all right level, that women in theory are seen as being equals, and they have those positions, but in practice they often have positions which show that indicate that they're seen as being lower status. Also try and tease apart the difference between urban and rural, or between Soviet elite and low-skilled worker women as well. Just in finishing, a note or two about women in politics in the Soviet Union. Although the Soviet Union's Communist Party had said that women and men were equal from an early stage, women were underrepresented at all levels of politics. In 1932, for instance, women only made up 16% of party membership. Female delegates at congresses didn't represent more than 10% before 1939. And just generally, it's hard to think of that many women who were significantly involved in the Soviet Union's story. Alexandra Kollontai is the exception that perhaps proves that rule. She was the first woman to become a People's Commissar, being the People's Commissar for Public Welfare, and the first female ambassador in history. But other than her, there were only 7 women members of the Central Committee before the Second World War, so not very many at all. A few other names for you if you're interested. Nadezhda Krupskaya was Lenin's wife and another prominent member of the Central Committee. Katerina Furtseva, Furtseva, was the first woman to become a member of the Politburo, or the Presidium, as it was called at that point, in 1957. But she was kind of an ally of Khrushchev and declined. Her career declined after 1964. Women were represented in Soviet propaganda, often in a sort of ideal socialist role models, playing their part in the development of socialism. Some examples of that: Natalia Besmertnova, Bessmertnova, the ballerina from the Bolshoi Ballet Company, or Ludmila Savelyeva, Savelyeva, an actor who became famous for her role in War and Peace. And sports people were given high status, and lots of resources were put into women's sport by the Soviet Union. Irina Rodnina, I love the way that sounds, Rodnina, won 10 successive World Championship and 3 Olympic medals in ice skating. Olga Korbut, Korbut, was and Ludmila Turisheva, I'm not going to spell that one, were both gymnasts. Korbut at the Munich Olympics in 1972. Perhaps most significantly, Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space in 1963, the first and youngest woman to fly in space. She was there for almost 3 days and is still the only woman to fly solo in space, which seems extraordinary here in, well into the 21st century. Like Yuri Gagarin, Tereshkova became a Soviet hero. She's from an impeccable proletarian background and is still revered as a hero, quite rightly, in present-day Russia. So Soviet women clearly were able to excel, but the image of the industrious woman, which is often put forward, is probably the more accurate one. That often women were in situations where they worked hard and nobly, but were less regularly kind of like seen as the stars of the show. Also, the industrial worker in lots of these Soviet images is almost always male, and the peasant almost always a female. And this is kind of a sort of slightly can't think of the word, slightly below the waters, a reflection of the role of agriculture, linking that to the role of women and saying actually both of those are a little less important than men and industry. So just overall, women gained their status of women was in theory equal from 1918, but actually it remained, discrimination remained endemic, embedded in society. They had these roles, and these roles grew, and some of them achieved great high status, but they were few and far between. And most women were in positions where they could work, often had to work, but also had to do the family chores as well. And overall, their influence in politics remained really low, despite the equality and the encouraging start by Alexander Kollontai in 1917. I hope that's useful, and see you next time.